I want to say a couple of other quick words here. First off, this is being sponsored by Apprenticeships for America, which is a national nonprofit organization working to scale apprenticeship in the United States and representing apprenticeship sponsors and intermediaries. We're happy to do that. And if you're not a member or not sure if you're a member, please do join us by clicking the link that's here on the screen. We're going to actually be putting it in the chat in just a second. And then I also want to just encourage you to save the date if you could for March 12th through 13th. We're going to have our first ever apprenticeship summit. That'll be held in Washington, D.C. on the campus of Gallaudet University. Details on registration and sign up should be going up in the next day or two. And if you got an email from us about this webinar, you'll certainly get an email from us about the summit. But if you're not sure if you're on our sign-up list, either join us at the link that's given on the screen here, or put a note in the chat, and we'll be sure we get you connected to our summit coming up. Today's session is going to be really focused on the rules impact on sponsors and intermediaries. And what we're going to do is walk through the changes that the rules suggest by sort of topic area. We'll take a few Q&As on each topic area, and then we're going to walk through a very draft assessment of the burden that AFA has analyzed around some of these new rules, and ask for your comments and feedback on this. And I just want to acknowledge Kyle. Kyle, you're on the call here somewhere. Let's see, do we have you, Kyle? There's Kyle. Kyle Marinelli was gracious enough to help put together that analysis, and so he'll be taking notes as we go. And we fully expect to use your feedback to create a sort of final analysis of the burden as it relates to sponsors and intermediaries. I want to say one other thing. No, I'm going to actually jump right in. We're going to ask you all to participate in a quick Menti poll here. If you've never used Menti, just go to menti.com and enter that code at the top of the screen, 7675-5208, or you can just point your phone at the little graphic there, and it'll pull it up on your phone, and this will give us a sense of who's in the room. Thank you so much for participating. Appreciate it. Very happy to have a good representation of intermediaries and sponsors on this call. All right, very, very helpful. We'll close it off there, but it gives us a sense of sort of who's in the room. I appreciate it. And as we expected, we have a good, healthy population of apprenticeship intermediaries and sponsors. That's what we hope for this call. But I also want to just acknowledge others from the larger workforce development system and other participants in the other stakeholders in the apprenticeship process. Great to have you with us today. So I want to, again, we'll be putting all these links in the chat, so you'll have access to them. But there's an increasing number of resources now available to folks to understand the rules as they're being proposed. First and foremost, I want to just acknowledge that the rules were published today in the Federal Register. And so we have a link here to the Federal Register official publication of the rules. I will tell you that we haven't done a correspondence of the draft rules as they were published on the Department of Labor website and the Federal Register rules as they were published. Our assumption was that there was just going to be a little bit of cleanup, no substantive changes between the two, but I haven't actually done that analysis. We haven't done that analysis yet, so we don't have a sense of if there's any changes. Our assumption is that there isn't, and that but nevertheless, the Federal Register is now the official uh, 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 version of these proposed rules. And importantly, a clock starts ticking today. We have 60 days to get comments to the Department of Labor on these rules. And so this webinar and some of the analysis that Apprenticeships for America is doing is really in preparation to building up an assessment of those rules and being able to provide feedback to the department on those rules. And I should just say, while of course the Apprenticeships for America will be giving its own assessment of the rules, we're very, very strongly encouraging other organizations, other stakeholders in the apprenticeship system to participate in the comments process. And we'll be launching a comments campaign in about 4 weeks to make sure that we get as many perspectives and viewpoints to the department as possible. In addition to the rules themselves, I just want to call your attention to a couple of analyses that Apprenticeships for America has done. First off, we have published a summary of the rules based on the rules that were published on the Department of Labor website. We've also done, just recently published a side-by-side review of the rules that looks at the existing rules, the proposed rules for apprenticeships, and the proposed rules for CTE apprenticeship. We have just put together a sort of sneak peek early version of the burden analysis. You're going to get some slides that'll be snapshots from that analysis, but that's available for you to download. And then I did want to encourage you, if you haven't already, there is going to be a webinar next week hosted by the Department of Labor that will be its official presentation on the Notice of Proposed Rules. And so encourage you to participate in that. Any questions about any of those materials? And I'm just going to put all those links in our chat right now. Any questions on that? Great, everyone. Then we're going to move right along. I've said this in other gatherings like this. The proposed rules are quite comprehensive to speak to a wide-ranging set of changes to the apprenticeship process in the United States. In fact, I would argue that there really isn't a single aspect of the apprenticeship system that is left untouched by these new rules. Want to encourage you to think expansively about what these rules might mean to the way that you are currently practicing apprenticeships, or if you're not currently practicing apprenticeships, what it might mean to you as a stakeholder in the apprenticeship system. And so really, what this graphic lays out is that the entire life cycle of an apprenticeship is really touched by these new rules. So the process of actually identifying an occupation that is suitable, or what used to be called, or is called in the current rules, apprenticeable, is affected by these rules. The standards of apprenticeship are expanded and more enumerated in much more detail. The registration requirements change. There's a new program standards adoption agreement that's really intended to ensure that employers are fully bought into apprenticeships for group-sponsored apprenticeships. There's an expanded set of rules around the apprenticeship agreement. There are new operational requirements for sponsors and intermediaries. And there are new reporting requirements. So really from initiation to the graduation and completion of an apprentice and all the reporting that goes along with that, changes to digest in this work. I also just want to acknowledge and really tip a hat to the Department of Labor in that the rules do seem to make a much more active contemplation of the role of intermediaries in the apprenticeship system. Not explicitly referenced at all in the current rules, intermediaries now have explicit reference in the career and technical education apprenticeship section of the rules. And there's a sort of implicit understanding of the role of intermediaries in the discussion of the new program standards adoption agreement in the rules. I'll also just say that from conversations we've had with the Department of Labor and others, there's also a sort of implicit understanding that an intermediary is really intended to be a solutions provider or enabler, particularly as it relates to some of the new rules as they relate to employers. Of course, that's all without any resources to go along with it. These are rules, not an appropriation. But nevertheless, I think there is a sort of emerging view within these rules and at the Department of Labor of the importance of apprenticeship intermediaries. For this session, we're going to make a really sort of stylized assumption, which is that sponsors and employers are not going to be treated the same. That is to say, we're going to deal with a sponsorship aspect of apprenticeship and leave aside the employer side. We know that employers can also be sponsors, and tomorrow's webinar will actually focus on the employer side of the equation. But for today's webinar, we're just going to focus on the sponsorship function and some of the changes in the rules as it relates to sponsorship. What we're going to do next is just sort of walk through one by one the major topic areas of the new rules. We'll just do a quick review. Yes, thank you. Thank you on the apprenticeship event. More will be coming, so thank you for the chat. So what we're going to do is walk through topic by topic, walk through the sort of headline changes, and then you're going to see there's a chart here that seeks to sort of code or at least give a sense of the impact of the rule on burdens for sponsors and intermediaries, and we'll sort of walk through that and get your perspectives on it. So first off, we're going to deal with the question of suitability. You all probably know that in order for an apprenticeship to be registered, it must be in an occupation that's been determined to be suitable. And there are certain expectations around what the suitable process or the process of determining suitability will look like. In the current rules, or in the proposed rules, I should say, there's a much more elaborated process on what that suitability process looks like. And so I just want to sort of walk through a couple of the high-level changes in that area. First off, there is a new expectation that in order for an occupation to be suitable for apprenticeship, it should have a sustainable wage. Second off, there are components for any suitability proposal. So sponsors of an apprenticeship in a new occupational area that has not currently been determined to be suitable must provide a work process schedule. There must be a related instruction outline and a description of what the classroom education will look like. There must be a discussion of any interim or other kinds of credentials that are associated with the apprenticeship. So all that needs to be laid out in advance. What's more, there's also the expectation that the suitability analysis would be reviewed and updated every 5 years. So every occupation that is currently listed as suitable will go through a review process within the next 5 years, and every new one every 5 years on its anniversary. And then finally, there's a discussion in the rules around what is often known as splintering of occupations, which is to say that a proposed occupation should not be a small subset of an already existing occupation, nor should it replicate the work process schedule of an approved occupation, which is just to say that the department is putting a stake in the ground to say that it does not want to contribute to this sort of splintering of apprenticeship, of occupational recognition in apprenticeship. And I will just say that there is a counter view to that, which is that not allowing for new apprenticeship occupations sort of holds back apprenticeship from evolving and growing as occupations change. So this is really intended to sort of capture the high-level changes that are likely to affect any sponsor that's going to be in a position of needing to register or go through the suitability process for a new occupation. Let me just stop there and ask if there's any questions, and feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand, and then we can recognize you. Any questions? Yeah, splintering in reverse. That is to say, if you were going to consolidate, thank you for that question, Andy. So the question is, what happens in splintering in reverse? The rules don't really speak to it. I think it's a really great question. I think the whole question of splintering probably deserves some commentary from the field. And so encourage you to, I'd love to hear more about what your concerns are there. Because I think that this is going to be a topic of significant conversation. Josh, please jump in here.
Hey, thank you. So one question about suitability in state apprenticeship agency offices like mine and the other 30 plus around the country. We have currently the option to create what we call a state level occupation, a 9,000 number in Rapids. It's unclear if that is being taken away. Just for the sake of everybody who's on the call who might not be in a state apprenticeship agency state, those get treated for all intents and purposes within the state the same as any other federally set up occupation. Biggest difference is they are not automatically guaranteed reciprocity for, in my case, from Alabama to Georgia or whatever. And so my question is, would we still have the option to do that? And I can't suss that out. Maybe I'm just not reading carefully enough, but I can't really tell if we'd still have the option to do that or not.
I actually had the same impression, Josh. And if there's anyone on the call who has a view on that, it'd be great to hear. But I thought the rules were kind of silent on that question, didn't really speak to it. So an area maybe in the comment process to get greater clarity. I noticed in the chat a couple of questions around the sustainability question. I had exactly the same question when I was reading through the rules. I suspect this will be a administrative aspect of the Office of Apprenticeship and the administrator's role to sort of come up with a process or standards around sustainability. I think that's a great question for and an opportunity, a place to comment in the comment process. And then, Jake, just on the question of overlap, 50%, 80%, I don't recall there being a particular number there. I think this is kind of recognized as being more art than science. And so I think this is likely to be, that's likely to remain vague. Yeah, I don't think there's the rules speak to it at all. And then, right, can occupation changes apply to role creation as well? So, Kara, can you just give an example of that?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just coming from a perspective of as jobs continue to be created that are occupations that probably didn't exist 5, 6, even 2 years ago. How will this apply to some of those areas? And the greatest example is Gen AI, anything along those lines.
I think you raise a really, really good point. And we see it in even in the construction trades, that's an industry that changes. And so how the challenge of having a sort of first person or the first person to get a suitability recognition then sort of creates the state of play seems a little counter to the idea of an evolving process around this. So I think that's a great place to weigh in on comments.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. I'm just going to move us on to the next phase of the conversation of this particular topic, unless there's a pressing question from anybody else. Great question. So apologies for the small print here, but what we are looking for, candidly, is feedback from this group on the question of burden and the question of whether or not some of the new rules either create significant new burdens for intermediaries or sponsors, or whether there isn't really a significant change in burden. And I just want to give and so in this area, you can see sort of one by one, we've gone through and done a first pass, a first pass on what we think burdens look like. So for example, we actually think the issue of uh, 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 of the sustainability may actually be a burden, depending on sort of what the rules are around sustainability. That's that third item there. And that's why we put that box in red. On the other hand, we think other aspects of this are sort of middling or not significant burdens for intermediaries and sponsors. So just looking over this, it would be great to hear if there's if anyone has sort of a different take on particular aspects of the rule changes that would be significant burdens and that we're not showing that, or that we think might be burdens, but you all think might not be. So any feedback on this coding here? And also, I'm just going to invite Kyle to jump in here with if there's questions or other thoughts on this. Thanks, Kyle. Questions or reactions? I will say one thing that we have been thinking about at Apprenticeships for America is the notion that basically you have to do all the work to set up an apprenticeship if you're working in an area that doesn't have suitability determination. You have to do all the work to set up an apprenticeship, and there's a possibility that it may not get approved. And so I think one thing that we are going to advocate for is a more expedited suitability process, including one that may not necessarily require a sponsor to do that front end work. I mean, maybe the administrator should actually use ONET data and other things to identify occupations that might be suitable and take that on and so that's certainly one thing that we're looking for feedback on. Maybe I should just ask, is there anyone on the call who has gone through an apprenticeability or suitability determination and has thoughts on that process as it currently stands? Yeah, Josh.
Hey, yes, we just recently did and created a new occupation for a therapeutic horseback instructor that was nationally approved. It was the process itself, just the website wasn't particularly good, but it was just, not a great website, but it wasn't hard. But once we submitted, even with pretty direct connections into the OA, it was kind of in a black hole, and then it just stayed in a black hole for several. I'd have to go by. I don't want to lie exactly, but it was a long time. And I've heard similar experiences from other people. And we felt like we had to really, really do a lot of the legwork and gather and have multiple meetings with folks from all across the country to validate and vet the content, the competencies, and all that kind of stuff. And while we were waiting, and I kind of mentioned this pre-meeting in the little chat there, while we were waiting for this thing that we felt like we had truly busted our tails on and was a valid occupation, while we're waiting on that answer, we couldn't get an answer. We see an approved occupation for DJs come out from the feds. And so it really was disheartening. And I'm not kidding. I mean, that's a real thing. Like, they put out a approved work process for DJs. And it specified like not radio, like party DJs. I'm not kidding you. Go look it up. It's a thing. And so it really kind of took I had been impressing on the organizations how, like, this is a national model, people. You got to take this seriously. You got to work hard on it. You got to commit a lot of time. This is important. And they saw that thing come out. I don't even know how most of them found out about it. And it was like, are you kidding me? We should have we should have just thrown darts at a board and come up with the thing. So I guess my comment there is, one, it took too long, and the arbitrary nature of the approval process, because of what seems like a very subjective evaluation on the other end, was disheartening to folks that I had asked to invest a good bit of time in the development.
Thanks for that, Josh. And I also just want to say, we actually gave a shout out to that particular registration in our eDigest newsletter. That was a really amazing bit of work. So I know it took a lot, but congratulations on getting that done. I want to just acknowledge Deborah's comment. And actually, somebody just took down their hand. Is Not gonna participate. Okay. I want to acknowledge Deborah's comment on the time, on the notion that a sort of administrator generated or auto generated occupational suitability might be welcome here. Any other comments? Oh, Jill, there's Jill. You had your hand up.
Yeah,
Please.
sorry, I did have my hand up, but I really just wanted to echo everything that Josh mentioned. I'm with Apprenti and WTIA, and we've submitted several occupations and the tech industry for apprenticeability, and everything that he said, it really is across the board. All the research and the building and of the apprenticeability, trying to get it submitted. You know, for a while, you know, they had the new apprenticeability request on Rapids. It works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have to also do the paperwork and forward that as a DOL as well. And then just like he said, it's in this black hole for 2 months, 3 months, 5 months. And then you work with national organizations, with employers to vet this. And really, it's on the sponsors to try and get this, you know, these references that the DOL wants to, you know, get comments from. But we've been advocating for a while, you know, within certain industries, if they just had a go-to panel that they could go to in those industries to just get comments and say, hey, does this make sense? Does this work process make sense? Instead of putting it all back on sponsors and intermediaries to do all that research.
Excellent. Thank you, Jill. Just in
Hey, John,
time,
real quick, I just want to mention that because the talking about like the 30-90 day thing, days within this rule have been changed to calendar days and not work days, just so you are all aware. It is full 7 days, 24-hour, not business days.
Thanks for that clarification, Connor. Great. I'm going to move us along. Move us along and talk about the sponsor intermediary requirements. This is for the standards of apprenticeship. Just wanted to point out that there are now new requirements that speak to the recruitment and acceptance efforts, all part of a broader interest in the rules about ensuring equitable participation and diversity in apprenticeship. There are new requirements that speak to the requirement that related technical instruction providers and methods be more stipulated up front. So who your provider is going to be, what methods they're going to use. There are new requirements that require sponsors to describe any interim credentials, new requirements around an interim assessment process for apprentices. Not that you probably were already doing them, but now that needs to be stipulated as part of the standards of apprenticeship. There are some new rules around wage progression, namely that wages have to start at least at a minimum wage and need to have their last step be no less than 75% of the journey worker's wage for that area. There are new requirements. There's a new requirement around the timing of on-the-job instruction, on-the-job training, such that everyone must be sort of in a hybrid circumstance around that. And instead of just being purely clock-based or purely competencies-based, there's now an expectation that the 2,000-hour requirement would apply to everyone, but that folks could move through more quickly based on competencies as long as those are spelled out. And then finally, there's a variety of attestations about compliance with laws and compliance with this and that that are now part of the standards for apprenticeship. Again, let's just take a few questions, and I see in the chat. Thank you, Nicholas. The question of whether or not the Department of Labor is in a position to actually be able to process all this new paperwork and these new expectations. That's a really great question, that I don't think we have answers to. So that's definitely there. And then and then let me just open it up for any other questions or reactions to this sort of high level analysis here. Andy Smith notes, and actually I've worked on an apprenticeship like this, where apprentices don't start at a sub journey worker wage and actually just move straight to the journey worker wage. I don't think the rules say anything against that. I take that back, actually, because there's a requirement of wage progression. I don't know how, yeah, thank you, Andy. I don't know how that sits. So that's a great piece of feedback for the comments process. Thank you. I will just say this question on what is the journey worker wage. I did not see ready identifiable benchmarks for how that is set. So my assumption is that there would be an expectation that the sponsor or the intermediary would have to sort of make a case for what that journey worker wage would be. But I think that's a great question. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to move us right. Oh, yep. We'll take one more here. It would be the highest paid worker in that position. I'm not actually sure that that's Carissa. I'm sorry. Is it Caritza? Are you on? Can you just say a word or two?
And I'm just speaking from my experience actually in the public transit world. That's how it's defined there. So the journey worker would be you know, the highest, the wage would be the highest paid worker within that position.
That doesn't quite ring right for me, but that I just might not know. Anybody have a different take on that?
John, if I can comment?
Yeah, Steve, please.
I believe it's and again, open to interpretation here, but I believe it's normally defined as the lowest wage that's paid to someone who's fully competent in that role.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
With
I
seniority,
stand corrected. You're right.
I think you're right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And let me just say, great, excellent.
Hey,
there was a question
Brian.
about sorry.
There's a question from Ross saying about the new rules if the hybrid hours are going to apply to both OA and SSA states.
I did not see any sort of carve out on that, so my assumption is that it applies to everyone. So yeah, I think that's the answer. All right, I'm going to move us on to our sort of burden analysis here, because a lot of the standards of apprenticeship were really carried forward. We actually saw that there wasn't significant new burdens imposed in a lot of areas. So, but I want to give the group here a chance to push back on any of the analysis that we have here on burden. If there's anything in here that seems like it's going to introduce new burdens that are more than sort of casual. And by the way, I have another screen on this, so this isn't everything. This is just the first half of the rules. Can I just ask on the third line, the third row here around the EEO obligations? I know there's already existing EEO obligations that are actually in a separate section that are not the subject of these rule changes. It did seem to me that there was a few new items sort of tacked on. Yes. Oh yes, we will definitely do that, Rick. We'll post the slide deck. It seemed like there were a few new expectations added to the EEO sort of compliance. Does anyone see that as a significant burden, or maybe not? Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, John. And for me, it's almost a sideways question now, but it's directly relevant to what you're asking. Question from me is, why is the standard still dealing with areas that are currently legislated for outside of apprenticeships? This is employer expectation to do business. So why is it being added inside the apprenticeship regulation itself? Because clearly, and there are a number of areas, you can go through OSHA and you can go through others. All of these are standard legal requirements. So as such, all they're doing is complicating the regulation and requirements that are in these documents. So I would actually ask that question as opposed to any particular individual elements.
And presumably, just in the spirit of burden, then burdening the sponsor with an enforcement requirement of laws that exist elsewhere. Okay, that's great, Andy. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And
Other
sorry,
thoughts or reaction?
So sorry if I can, John, just to follow on that. The group sponsor is not the employer generally. So actually what we're doing here is we're transmitting through an agreement something that they're already burdened with. So actually it's another hurdle that employers will push back on because it's overcomplicating the contracts or agreements.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Other reactions or thoughts to the burden analysis on this slide? And Josh, thank you for the shout out that the competency based does create the expectation that there would be advanced standing or the ability to move through faster, and being able to describe that and what that looks like is does create sort of new burdens for a program that had been just hourly based. That's great. Appreciate that. This is our second slide that's really intended just to capture the rest of the rules for this area. I'm just going to note we're going to come back on record keeping and attestation because while to keep records doesn't take a lot of burden, actually keeping the records does. And so we've got a whole separate analysis on that. Just know that there's more to come on the record keeping. Any other comments on some of the aspects of this burden analysis?
I think Jake had his hand up earlier.
Jake, anything you want to add?
On the previous slide, I did have a comment. I noticed it was green for like identifying the training for the trainers and instructors need the necessary qualifications and experience. That's something that I could see being a challenge, because if it's a challenge to identify who the instructors will be, then this would I know in New York, for example, we have this requirement and they're like, it says there should have to be certified as like qualified in adult learning, and we're dealing with youth. So there's just, it's like, it might depend on what they're looking for in terms of these qualifications, could be like just an extra burden as well.
Thanks for that. Other thoughts? I appreciate the shout out on the equity and benefits. I think that's a really great question, but I think it is supposed to apply to everything. There was no carve out for leave policies or other sorts of things. So there was meant to be equity between the apprentice and the non-apprentice employees. If anyone has a different view, please shout that out. Any other comments on this, or we're going to move on? Turning to the registration process, there are actually in another webinar, we're going to deal with some of the occupational standards and the prospects that they may have for streamlining registration among in occupations that actually use those standards. But I do want to just point out that there were some additions or elaborations to the registration process in the new rules. Again, back to one of the themes of the new rules, that there would need to be a plan for equitable recruitment and retention practices, including a discussion of where I can't remember if it's CTE or the regular, where opportunities would be posted, that sort of thing. There's a new requirement to show fiscal solvency for a sponsor. There's a requirement that any employer who's part of an apprenticeship registration who's had workplace practice law violations, those need to be disclosed. That the EEO compliance plans should include anti-harassment training, not only for mentors, journey workers who are working with apprentices, and for the related instruction providers. And there's a requirement to stipulate the qualifications of teachers of related instruction. Okay, so we've had a number of comments. I'm sorry, no, whoops, sorry, I'm catching up. Let me just ask questions on this. Any questions? Steve?
No, I'm focusing in on the sponsor fiscal solvency. I think that's
Yes.
overreach a bit.
Thanks for noting that. Any other thoughts or reaction? Andy?
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to keep jumping in. Certainly, I think the two areas that I think are quite interesting here is I think the qualifications is a real that could be a real problem in many instances, because the experts on the job who would be coaching and training individuals may not be experts through qualification, but through experience and practice. And this could eliminate those people from participation. So that's a major issue. And I do think, again, the equitable recruitment and retention practices, again, we have to be careful here. There are laws that already cover these activities. And as a group sponsor or intermediary, you may not be the employer. And actually, therefore, we have to make sure that the intermediary isn't effectively put in a position that they create almost a facade of a plan just to satisfy a requirement, where actually they are not the employer.
Thank you for that, Andy. And just on the qualifications, there is actually a phrase that seems to suggest experience in the field counts as qualifications. So there may be an opportunity to comment on that, or to provide some support for that position, Andy. And then I'll also just say, I think one of the other challenges here, and just having set up a few apprenticeship programs myself, is that when you're working with an employer prospectively and working to get the apprenticeship all set up, having all of this at the front end is not necessarily sort of how the employer thinks about doing this work. They're going to identify, their journey workers or their mentors after the apprenticeship has already been approved. So, and given the timelines of approval, it may be unreasonable to expect that employers or even a related instruction provider would have all this nailed down prospectively for an apprenticeship that's still in development. So that's certainly a concern that I would bring to some of the desire for more description in the registration process. Shari.
Hey, John. One area in the staffing world that a term that we use quite a bit is the co-employment. And to Andy's point, the more that is written in there that suggests that a sponsor is an employer, creates that co-employment world, which you really want to stay away from.
Excellent point. Actually, I hadn't thought of that. That's great, Shari. Thank you for that. Any other comments or thoughts on this at a high level, and then we'll go to the burden. Now, oh yeah, any other? Great. Shari, one more? No. Okay, great. All right, excellent. In the chat, actually, Jim asked a really good question. So Jim, thanks, Jim Rosapep. Is there anything in here that folks like? So we've heard a lot of concerns. Are there any things in the registration process, or if we want to go back to the program standards, anything in here that you all like, or that you feel like we should be supporting within the new rules. That good, huh? No, just kidding.
John, I would just say the recruitment and retention practices, some of these I don't think are necessary to be rewritten and updated, but there are some that I would, on your color coding scheme, I just put as neutral. They're not good because we didn't necessarily need to add that stipulation because the work was already being done, but they're not high impact. So it's two different questions. Like I don't like them necessarily, but it's not a high impact problem.
Because they're already being done, right?
Yeah.
That's a very fair criticism of this burden analysis. It assumes the system we have is completely efficient, which is not necessarily the case. Appreciate that, Josh. Thank you. Any other comments on the burden analysis on this slide? Shari.
So you had just asked the question, John, about is there anything that we like? Well,
great.
I think it would be really amazing if there were some responsibilities or accountabilities from the DOL. And, we were talking about that 30-90, but if there was something that gave a more realistic time period of returning decisions and moving forward, if they were giving those who are trying to do the heavy work some commitments that, yes, we're going to make decisions, we're going to make them timely, we're going to make them consistently. I'm not really seeing all that except that 90 days, and truly 90 days can be quite a long time to wait to launch something.
Yep. Thank you for that. So to the extent we can get expectations, I've heard someone say, having clarity around what you're going to get is, even if it's not great, is better than not having clarity. And so, getting clarity around that and making sure that and to be clear, some of what's in the rules is actually putting on paper stuff that's been happening before. And so to the extent that creates more clarity, that's a good thing. Josh.
Sorry, I have a lot of opinions on these things, but along that same theme that you're talking about there with, their expectations being placed on sponsors and employers and all this with timelines that they've got to meet and all that. And this is not in this particular section, but when you get over to the part that requires state apprenticeship agencies to submit these very detailed plans, which I think will be probably covered on a different webinar
next week.
But just to that point, nobody is requiring the Office of Apprenticeship, who is managing the other 20 states or however many are not SAAs, who's evaluating their plans in this way? And are they having to write a plan? No, they're not. I mean, of course, they're not going to turn a plan into themselves. And they don't have to publicly give us a plan that we get to approve. So there's a definite and, differentiated burden for state apprenticeship agencies. And again, I hate subjective judgments. So the idea that I've got to put what I think is my strategic plan, is adequate and appropriate, and I put it in there. And let's just face it, if the administration in DC changes, then you get a different interpretation of what's adequate and appropriate, and suddenly my SAA status is on the line. So there's anyway, just following that theme of timelines for us, no timelines for them kind of concept.
Fair enough. I want to turn to just a couple of the questions in the chat. Is there any language or anything that speaks to online training providers or their qualifications? I didn't see anything. So I guess you could say there's parity between online and in person. Although that some of the framing of the rules seems to imply an expectation of in-person training. But I didn't see anything specific to the online training providers.
John, I didn't see anything specific in there either about the online training providers. Just generally speaking, though, I would assume that they will have to follow kind of the same
Same rules.
standards for qualifications. And that's just because all workforce development programs generally are moving online. So I figure it's going to be the same across the board.
Any other questions or thoughts on the burden analysis that's shown here? This is the last, as you can imagine, the program registration is a fairly lengthy article in the rules. So this is the last slide. All right, we're going to turn to a new feature in the rules, something that had been dealt with in a sub-regulatory, I think is the way they described it in the rules, a sub-regulatory process, but is now being sort of elevated to a rule, which is something called the Program Standards Adoption Agreement. And it's really intended to be an agreement that speaks to group sponsorship and ensuring that employers are aligned with the program standards. I'll just note that, so every employer who's part of a group sponsor would need to sign this program standards adoption agreement. And these agreements would then be submitted every ways of signing to the registration agency. Any question? I'm sorry, before we move to this, any questions about the program standards adoption agreement? I like the chat. And the chat is we're going to be preserving that and mining that for comments and feedback. So please keep it up. Our take on this is that most group sponsors had some version of a program standards adoption agreement or an employer agreement. The one thing that we were a little bit skeptical about, and we'll get to in reporting, is some of the requirements that employers participate in, some of the reporting obligations. We think that that can be off-putting, and that there may be other sort of turnoffs to employers in these program standards adoptions agreements that we're going to have to pay attention to, but that will actually be, handled in tomorrow's conversation around employer burdens. So from a sponsor perspective, we didn't see that there was a big added burden here, given that most sponsors were already doing this. Andy, just on the employer apprenticeship agreement, I think this would supplant that, as I understand it, that had been handled in a sub-regulatory fashion. Now this is the new EAA. Do people agree with that? Do I have that right? They may have a different view. All right, any other thoughts on this? The apprentice agreement is also given a lot more elaboration in the new rules. There's always been apprenticeship agreements, or the current rules currently speak to apprenticeship agreements. They're just now given more detail in these rules. You can see some of the disclosures and items that are expected to be in the apprenticeship agreement. I will say one theme that seems to pop up in almost every section is around unreimbursed costs to the apprentice, that needs to be disclosed and managed and reported. The question of how the assessment process will take place, what pay will look like. Another theme that seems to pop up across a number of sections is pay for related instruction time, and whether or not apprentices should be able to expect that. There are a couple of prohibitions that are brand new. So non-compete agreements cannot be part of any apprenticeship agreement. And while non-disclosure agreements are allowed, any non-disclosure agreement that would impede the apprentice from seeking employment in that occupation with another employer is not allowed. And then there's an expectation that these apprenticeship agreements would be submitted to the registering office within 30 days. Questions on that?
John, we often get a question, the difference between a non-compete clause and what we call a work commitment, where an employer says, hey, I'm going to pay for your 2 years of college or your 4 years of college, whatever, and I'm going to ask you to commit to work for me for 2 or 4 years after that. And we've got some guidelines in the state about what we will accept and what we won't, so that it's not limiting that apprentice's ability to go take another job. But many employers, particularly in healthcare, it's very common that they want them to sign an agreement that, you know, if I pay for you for college for 2 years, you got to work for me for 2 years. If not, then you owe me back some prorated amount of what I paid for your Not sure how that's going to be interpreted. Is that considered a non-compete clause or what?
That's a great question. And Josh, presumably these arrangements have been blessed, at least in some fashion, by the Office of Apprenticeship up till now.
The Federal Office of Apprenticeship hasn't had an opinion on them one way or the other.
Okay, all right, excellent. All right,
well, they may have opinions,
that's a
they don't have any rules on them. But
it's a great question. Yeah. And it may trigger the unreimbursed clause in here. They may treat that as an unreimbursed activity. Prospectively, I don't know. It's silent on it, and it's a great place for further questions and comments for the department. Thanks for that. Any other questions, comments?
John, I do have a question, I guess.
Yes,
when
Steve,
you
go
look
ahead.
at things like prohibitions where a state allows for non-disclosure agreements, but yet the apprenticeship space does not, it seems like there's a direct conflict there, and it's going to force states to have to go through some legislative changes themselves if they, I think, I don't know how those get ironed out. But it just seems like there's this might drag on for a while, I guess is my point, before some of these get implemented, because it's legislative hurdles that have to happen state by state by state. I guess would be my comment.
So first off, completely agree. And the notion that states will have to repass or will have to revisit their legislation and pass new legislation does seem daunting. Now, I will say in the document, in the rules, there is an expectation that there would be a transition period to the new rules. I think it's different for different aspects, but I think there's like a 2-year window for states. May even be longer for states to get sort of compliant with the new rules. So the department, all that's just to say, the department agrees with you. But I think it's worth looking at those transition rules to see if they in fact look reasonable. Thank you, Josh. 2026, right? Even longer, right? Thank you. No, that's 2 years. No, it is 2 years. Okay, right, 2 years. Any other comments or questions? Okay, sorry, Cindy, can you jump in here just so save me from reading your comment?
Hi, John. Sorry, I'm in a kind of a noisy area, so I'll try to make this quick. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah, just a thought as we go through this that that we look at all of these changes through an equity lens. And that, again, we're talking about burdening, which isn't the same as equity. And burdening is important. It's important for us to talk about modernizing and renovating and updating an existing system. But I don't want us to lose track of equity as we look through these changes. So
Great.
who
Yeah.
does this benefit? Who does this marginalize? And how can we eliminate those marginalization and increase the benefit? Because some of these changes are going to be different for others than it is for perhaps you know, a mainstream organization, what have you. And so I really want us to keep that in mind as we move forward. And thanks for letting me comment on that.
Cindy, thank you for your comment, and thanks for the note in the chat. Appreciate it. I will just say, as a practical matter, the apprenticeship agreement is already an expectation of most of all apprenticeship programs, and so adding to it in and of itself is not necessarily a burden. There are certainly aspects of the apprenticeship agreement that I think do introduce new expectations, and in particular, I would just say there's quite a bit of conversation in the apprenticeship agreement or in the rules around disputes and disagreements, complaints. And I would just encourage you all to look at those and try to assess what that means for you as those of you who are sponsors, because I'm curious as to whether or not that whole dispute resolution process creates burden or challenges for apprenticeship sponsors. Any reaction to that? I know we're at the top of the hour. We did actually commit to letting you go by quarter past. So I'm just going to run through really quickly the remaining sections of this presentation. We're really towards the end here. The main thing around operational requirements, in addition to some of these dispute resolution or complaints processes, I did want to point out there's now a requirement for an endpoint assessment. Not given a lot of structure, except that there should be one. And we're going to come back to reporting in just a second, quite a bit on the record keeping of an apprenticeship program in order to stay compliant with the rules. Any questions or feedback on these rules?
John?
Andy.
Oh, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yeah, I'm sorry. And Shari. Let's start Shari and then Andy.
Just in the same vein that I brought up before, I really believe the safety records is so far out of purview of a sponsor. We would have no control. I mean, we can make them a test, but other than that, again, that's that co-employment issue.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Andy.
Yeah, I was just going to basically have the same point, to be honest. Some of the areas that are identified there are not in the sponsor's hands. Employment decisions, we may be different to many other sponsors, but we would actually not be involved in the employment decision, as it says. And I think for me, it's about the detail here. Are we talking about the employment as in who can become an apprentice? Because all of our apprentices are fully employed from day one. Or is this trying to deal with scenarios where, and we know it happens on some programs, where people participate in the apprenticeship program and then are subject to an employment or a continuing employment decision at the end of the program? So for me, I think we need more detail here. But again, going back to the point that Shari raised, a lot of this is out of the hands of sponsors and is actually dealt with elsewhere.
Excellent point. My assumption is that some of this would be the record keeping requirements would be downstreamed through the participation agreement, and the employer would be expected to sort of keep these and make them available, under certain circumstances. Then we're creating employer issues, but my guess is that that's going to be the answer of the department to how sponsors sort of keep track of this.
And for me, that really should be part of the participation and agreement with the employer when they agree to take on apprentices with the sponsor. you agree to abide by these rules.
Exactly. I think it's the downstreaming that they're trying to get at here, but we can look at the wording and see if there's a better way to get at that. Great.
Yep.
I want to move us on to some of the reporting because at least my read is the reporting. I think all of us want to see more data from the system to be able to track its success, to be able to improve it. But there's quite a bit here on reporting. And so really the rules sort of break this up between apprentice level and then program level reporting. So apprentice level reporting really intended to sort of share with the registering office the demographics and the developments as they relate to individual apprentices. You can see the kinds of things that they're asking for here, all to be reported within 30 days. And then any change in the apprentice, after the apprentice is registered, any change in the apprentice's position, again, all to be reported within 30 days, wages, supportive services, all that sort of thing. On the program level, again, there's a requirement in the new rules that changes that relate to the program itself, contact information, and so on, get reported all within 30 days. And then there's a series of outcomes requirements, completion rates, and so on that get at the sort of the impact of an individual apprenticeship program, all to be reported on an annual basis.
John, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'll be real quick. Do you know, I know there's a lot of emphasis on reporting and the system, and we all know Rapids pretty fluently. Is there any effort that you're aware of that's going to be allowing people that do need to report out on apprenticeship programs, whether it's for grant purposes, incentive purposes, that instead of retransferring that data to DOL for data they already have, that they will be able to pull it if we give them Rapids numbers or something similar? It's a PII risk, and it seems like something that's already in their system.
I'm sorry. Thank you for that comment.
Didn't mean to make a joke on that one.
Sorry, my bad. Any other comments or questions? I think this question of interoperability between data systems is a really good one, and probably one we're not going to solve in the rules, but we should be working with the department on trying to figure out how to be smarter about how we do these data transfers, including how do we get existing MIS program software to be able to talk directly to Rapids in some sort of secure fashion. So more to come on that. Any other questions, comments? Okay. I'm going to move us along just to say thank you to everyone for participating in today's session. We will be sharing these slides, a summary of the session, so appreciate that. Probably not till the end of next week or early the week that follows. And then in the meantime, I want you to stay connected to Apprenticeships for America as we work through the comment process and begin organizing ourselves for and helping our members organize for our comment campaign to be able to make sure that the Department of Labor hears feedback and thoughts and suggestions on these rules. Again, thank you so much for participating today and look forward to staying in touch with you on this very important issue. Thanks.